I think we should all know by now that fight scenes are complicated. In the video linked up in the corner of the screen, we discussed the micro of fight scene writing, sentence structure in prose, word choice, verb placement, and so on. But today we're discussing the macro of fight scene writing, broader ideas like scene structure, keeping it interesting, making the fight matter, magic systems, and realism. And maybe the algorithm might like this video a bit more because I get to use pretty pictures. And of course, a big thank you to patrons. The last couple of videos haven't done quite as well as I had hoped, so your support means that I'm able to continue doing more niche content like this. If you would like to join the Patreon Discord with me, then thank you very much, and the link is down below. Part 1. Scene structure. First and foremost, fight scenes are still scenes, and they follow the flow of one. They rise and fall in tension because a one-note scene is just not that interesting. The most common model for any given scene is of course the 3-act structure. There's a really fantastic video by Michael Tucker on Casino Royale's opening fight scene, which I recommend, but to build on our other video in which we discussed the fight in the Department of Mysteries and the Order of the Phoenix in detail, in Act 1, the fight with the Death Eaters begins. In Act 2, it escalates when Hermione is hurt and Neville's wand breaks. In Act 3 reaches its highest stakes when Harry's friends are captured and he is surrounded, before it is resolved with the arrival of the Order. Changing the stakes by complicating or escalating the problem the characters face multiple times like this makes for a more involving read because the obstacles change and actions have consequences. That's really important. It makes the eventual resolution more satisfying if it goes well, or heartbreaking if it goes wrong. However, I do want to emphasize that you don't need pages and pages to do this. Al-Makatsu does it in just 2 paragraphs in The Hunger. The fight begins, the fight escalates with the introduction of a knife, and it reaches its highest stakes when he's about to be stabbed, and is then resolved. The rise and fall makes this just 2-paragraph fight far more interesting than if it didn't change or escalate. In our other video on the sentence-by-sentence micro of a fight scene, we discussed where you should give detail, because showing every moment of a fight in equal close detail is boring and monotonous. It's difficult to read or watch because we don't know what we're meant to be focusing on. In particular, we highlighted how detail is afforded to those fight scene beats which either shift the balance of power, have narrative importance, or character importance. The 3-act structure actually helps here, because each of those points of escalation that complicate the stakes are usually accompanied by one of these 3 things. In The Last Airbender, Aang's fight with Fire Lord Ozai escalates at 3 different points. The first act escalation is given extra screen time because it shifts the balance of power against Aang. He is now fleeing from Ozai. The second act escalation has a massive power shift in the fight, and character importance as Aang chooses not to kill Ozai with lightning and is then cornered, so that gets extra screen time too. And the third act escalation has all 3 of these: narrative importance as the culmination of all the series' tension, character importance as Aang has to stick to his morals and find a new way to defeat Ozai without killing, as well as a massive shift in the balance of power as Aang defeats Ozai. So don't just escalate the conflict by adding more to the stakes, but add tension through shifts in balance of power, and depth through character and narrative importance in each of these escalations. A second structure that I personally like comes from K.M. Whalen's Structure in Your Novel, a book I do recommend. She gives a model which gets you to think about what's structurally around the fight scene that makes it meaningful. In A Storm of Swords, the fight between the Mountain and the Viper to decide Tyrion's fate is what Wayland would call the active scene. It's got a goal, it's got conflict, and it's got a disaster. He loses. But this active scene is followed by Tyrion reflecting on how he is now condemned to death, where he then decides, "I'll die with the taste of blood in my mouth." This scene is what Wayland calls a reactive scene. It's got a character's reaction, a dilemma about what to do next, and a decision. In a sense, this reactive scene is what makes the active fight scene meaningful, because it forces character introspection, and that is interesting. Structurally, pairing your active fight scene with a reactive scene gives the reader room to breathe, to relax after such high tension, and gives weight to the fight scene itself as they reflect on it. The point is, if your fight scene doesn't demand a reactive scene, then the fight scene may not have the right focus. It's a good way to figure out if you're just adding in fight scenes to artificially ramp up the tension. A reactive scene might just be changing strategies as well. The detective lays a trap for the killer, but the killer fights and escapes, and the detective has to reflect and figure out what their next step is. Part 2. At risk of titling a part of my video like a struggling married couple of 30 years, keeping it interesting. How do you keep a long fight scene interesting? We discussed how you escalate the fight and complicate the obstacles characters face to keep it from feeling monotonous, but my friends, there's only so long you can do this before you're building a third, bigger, badder Death Star. 3 escalations in the 3-act structure works for that reason, but this does present a problem for long fight scenes or battle scenes. What you'll find is that those like the Battle of Pelennor Fields and the Return of the King are composed of numerous small objectives: rally the troops, defend the gates, overrun the army, kill the Witch King, allowing multiple escalations and de-escalations as they achieve or fail in their objectives, extending the fight scene while maintaining a cohesive structure that isn't exhausting, just constantly and repetitively ramping up the stakes. On top of this, longer fight scenes often use multiple perspectives of characters who each have their own objective or struggle inside that battle. Pippin, Merry, Éowyn, and Gandalf in particular during the Battle of Pelennor Fields. If you are writing a long fight scene, then allow the reader the catharsis of objectives being achieved or failed, multiple releases of tension for better or worse. Allow the tension to de-escalate at points before ramping it up again. But crucially, one thing that makes a fight scene immensely more interesting is turning it into a problem-solving scene. I love it when people do this. In Leviathan Wakes, James S.A. Corey establishes right at the start of the fight that the Rocky didn't have enough torpedoes to fire shot after shot at the station from far off and hope that one of them made through the point defense fire. There's the puzzle. How do we best use our limited supplies of torpedoes? It's clear, it's simple, and they do a lot with it. The conflict in this scene isn't just a shootout where the only problem is can we kill him before he kills us. Instead, the fight is a multi-dimensional puzzle that the characters need to figure out, using each torpedo wisely. The Pirates of the Caribbean film series is basically famous for this tactic. The fight scene between Will, Jack, and forgettable captain guy isn't just them trying to kill each other, but a problem-solving scene as they each try to get the key. Almost every single fight scene in that series has a secondary problem-solving objective, and that's part of what makes them so fun and interesting. It also allows you to complicate the tension. They might be succeeding in one objective, but failing in the other, or forced to choose between them, which is a great thing to do in a fight scene. Part 3. At the risk of sounding like a mid-40s single male realizing he's wasted his life on mobile games, does it really matter? Chuck Sambucino, longtime editor and writer, puts it, "For a fight to have meaning, it must be essential to your story. Ask yourself what the purpose of the fight scene is. Is it to reveal character, to set up a crucial plot point that will have ramifications later? If you remove the fight scene, does the storyline completely fall apart? It should." I may not agree as strongly as he puts it here, but he does have a point. We discussed how it should demand a reactive scene before. That is one way to tell whether it kind of matters. And you'll know this as well, you've seen a Transformers movie. Fight scenes have a tendency to be a bit pointless, added in to spice up the story with a side of death. But I think the best way to put it is that to make the fight scene essential, you've got to figure out what question your fight scene is really asking beyond will they get out alive. This fight in The Shining is asking whether there is any humanity left in Jack Torrance. The final fight in Sanderson Skyward is asking whether Spencer will let go of her ego and eject from the flight craft. And this fight in The Order of the Phoenix is asking whether Harry will learn the prophecy made about him. These are narrative and character questions. See, a good fight isn't merely an obstacle to the next story beat, which is how some of them end up being, but they help develop a deeper narrative or character question as the fight happens, that is teased and perhaps answered by its end, making the fight itself crucial to the story and its payoff. Part 4. I know my audience, and I know that magic systems are basically heroin to you lot.
Get it into my veins.
So let's talk about how magic changes fight scenes. Firstly, let's talk about a problem I somewhat have with hard magic systems. Authors are often so focused on showing us how cool this thing they made is, particularly with hard magic, that they leave behind character and theme even at the climax to show us how this cool thing they made works. Look how flashy and pretty it is. In contrast, in The Last Airbender, and yeah, I'm just gonna keep talking about it because I love that series. Yeah. Zuko redirects lightning at his father during the climactic eclipse scene, a fantastical and awesome moment of Zuko using the magic system in a cool way that was set up earlier in Season 2, paying off here. But the writers also tied his character arc to this ability, having him full of inner turmoil that is resolved in this same moment when he chooses his own path, and playing into the theme of redemption always being possible. It's not just a cool fight scene, but it carries depth too, and that's what really makes it worthwhile. Point being, climactic fight scenes will be far more satisfying if they have character and thematic depth first and magic system coolness second. So let these elements be resolved at the same time so that the payoff to your magic system isn't left behind by character, and character isn't left behind by the magic system. It's just something to be aware of. It's a flaw I commonly read in these sorts of stories. The second thing is the use of a literary tool called Chekhov's guns. You've probably heard one of its many variations before. If in the first act you have hung a pistol on the wall, then in the following one it should be fired. Otherwise, don't put it there. And in reverse, a gun that goes off in the third act should be set up beforehand. Fight scenes involving magic systems are really dependent on the reader understanding the rules of what's possible and what's not. Go watch my 3-part series on them. Because of this, fight scenes are often used early on to give exposition about how a magic system works, showing it rather than telling it. Shad does this in The Shadow of the Conqueror, and Sanderson does this a lot in his work, writing briefly from the perspective of a character experienced in the magic system right at the start, to establish those rules so that later on, the magic system, or the gun, can go off. The other side of this coin is that if you're going to use a magic fight scene to resolve the tension of your story at the climax, then the gun, the magic system, needs to be set up beforehand, often with what's called a pre-scene. It happens in the hard sci-fi of The Three-Body Problem by Liu Cixin, probably the most mind-bending book I have ever read that I do recommend if you want your mind to be screwed. But a simple example that you would know of is Luke closing his eyes and trusting the Force to deflect a couple of lasers about halfway through the film, and then later trusting the Force to destroy the entire Death Star. This is an example of a pre-scene, a form of foreshadowing where something major in the story happens on a smaller scale in some way early on in the story. This is particularly relevant to climactic magic system fight scenes, because scenes like this establish the rules that make that climactic scene feel credible and cool. But the pre-scene doesn't need to be a smaller version of the fight, it just needs to be able to establish those rules. All of this makes the climax more believable and gives the reader the "oh, of course" moment, which is a great thing that you want your readers to have, particularly with magic systems. Part 5. Realism. Now, on the absolute opposite end of the spectrum to magic systems, fight scenes not being realistic is a common critique, but writing a realistic fight scene doesn't necessarily make for a good fight scene. In George R. R. Martin's A Game of Thrones, Bronn takes on Sir Vardis Egan for Tyrion, and it's relatively realistic. Martin highlights how heavy his armor is, how Bronn's height gives him extra reach, and how the narrow slit of Vardis' visor limits his vision. But it's how he sets up all of these elements and pays them off when they play a role in Sir Vardis' death that makes for a good fight scene. The main benefit of realism is that it helps with credibility and believability in fiction, allowing you to then build on that with more creative and fantastical elements which we buy into. But what are the fundamentals of realistic fighting? Hell if I know. My area of expertise is essay writing and boring people to death with philosophical arguments from the 1800s. But I know my audience, and I know you like swords.
Did somebody say swords?
Which is why I've got someone who knows a lot more about this sort of thing than I do to talk to you about realism. Shad?
Well, Tim, it would be my pleasure. So, what are real sword fights actually like? So, first thing to understand is that not every type of real form of combat is equivalent in how they play out. For instance, unarmed combat is very different to combat with a sword. Fighting with a sword and shield is very different with fighting against a sword and sword, because a shield is actually a defensive weapon that can help prolong the length of a battle because it's much easier to block incoming strikes.
And what I just said there also applies to people wearing armour, especially metal plate armour.
But when you get into a situation where all you have is a weapon, whether it's a polearm or it's just a big axe or sword, against someone who is in the same kind of situation, the first thing that you're going to learn about real, combat in that regard, they're short. The exchanges are very short until someone is either defeated or they're dead, okay? And how do we know this? Well, from modern day reenactment and also historical European martial arts. When we recreate this in the modern world, that's the reality of what we find. Now, in regards to unarmed combat, you'll also notice that generally they can be a lot shorter as well, and one solid hit on the side of someone's chin can knock them out cold. In fantasy, but also fiction, adventure, action movies or whatever, generally you see the people getting hit in the head again and again and again, and they're perfectly fine. This is very prominent with, say, Jackie Chan fight scenes. But in addition to that, Jackie Chan, he gets glassed on the head, like someone picks up a glass bottle, smashes him across the head in multiple times in his movies, okay, and he keeps fighting, okay? That would be devastatingly and almost lethal if you did it in real life. Like picked up a glass bottle and smashed someone over the head. That can almost kill him. And not kill him, it's going to cause massive injury, okay? And so another big difference between real fighting and, fictional fantasy fighting is that injuries happen a lot quicker and a lot easier. And that will generally end the fight right there. And this is not only doubly so, but so much more so when you throw in a deadly weapon like a sword, okay? And so when you're in a real fight with a sword and you have two opponents facing off against each other, oftentimes the fight will end in the first to maybe third, fourth exchange, where someone might come in with a thrust and there might be a parry riposte and then come in with a counter thrust. That could end it right there. Sometimes you do a feint to get the opponent to engage the blade in the way you want, like so, and then you come around with a counter strike like that. And that was two moves which can end the fight right then. It's actually far more rare to see a sword fight, but this is also an extension to any type of fight with swords that don't really have shields. It's rare for them to just get extended out in a series of parries, exchanges, blocks, and hits and counters. They do happen. Rarely.
But I should say that these longer drawn-out real-world sword fights are never as long as most cinematic sword fights that you see in film.
More often than not, the real fight is ended very, very quickly, sometimes even in the first move. And that's actually what you want to achieve as a swordsman. You want to either end them with the first hit or end them with the first defense. I was watching a HEMA tournament once where one opponent came down with a high strike like this, okay? And the defender, he simply did this, okay? Where he blocked the incoming strike like that, but with the extended portion of his blade, he hit his opponent right underneath their armpit. It was what is called a single tempo riposte. Now, a riposte is generally when you attack back or counter your opponent's move, and tempo is how many moves it takes to perform your action. And so a feint, like I showed before, like where you're there, that's a 2-tempo move. And so a single tempo riposte is a riposte where it's done in one move and it's ended right then. It showed remarkable skill and timing of the defendant who was able to pull it off, and it looked beautiful. But would it work in a action movie or a fantasy fight scene? Sometimes. This is when you need to balance on how realistic you want your fights versus how exciting, engaging, drawn out, and just, amazing with the fancy moves that are being executed. A series like Game of Thrones, for instance, lends itself to more gritty, realistic fight scenes. But even in Game of Thrones, say you had two swordsmen that came, to fight on each other, and they were just masters, like the best of the best. Well, then you could actually kind of try and justify a fight scene that was extended out a bit more in their exchanges, where there is blocks, ripostes, parries, feints, and the fight is drawn out in a really engaging way where you don't know who's going to win or lose. So even in more realistic settings, you can get away with what is technically far more unrealistic style of sword fighting but you can include realistic style moves in a fight that generally wouldn't play out the way that you're showing it, where it's extended with a lot of interchange back and forth. Because going back to that original point, real fights generally are very quick and are over very quickly, and injuries happen very easily.
But now, for the summary, let's get down to business. Firstly, fight scenes are still scenes. Consider using the 3-act structure with multiple escalations, with each escalation having a power shift, narrative importance, or character importance. On top of this, ask whether your fight scene demands a reactive scene. Secondly, longer fight scenes don't just use multiple escalations, but use numerous objectives that allow for de-escalation as well, success or failure of the characters. They also often give multiple characters different objectives. Thirdly, turning your fight scene into a problem-solving scene will make it immediately more multi-dimensional and interesting. Fourthly, figure out what narrative or character question the fight scene is really asking, exploring, and perhaps answering. Fifthly, consider pairing your climactic magic system fight scene with the conclusion of a character arc or theme, so that neither of these elements get left behind. Sixthly, fight scenes are a great way to deliver magic system exposition at the start. However, climactic magic system fight scenes really rely on pre-scene foreshadowing to give good payoff, so make sure you set those up. And seventhly, well, I recorded this before I got Shad's bit, so I don't know what he said, but the summary is whatever's on screen right now, so yeah. Just remember, kids,
Fight scenes are complicated.
and I really implore you to go watch the other video I made on fight scenes before this one. It's more in depth, it's more interesting, and way more important, going into the pros and the micro fight scenes that a lot of people don't usually discuss, and a lot of writers don't focus on nearly enough. The micro is super important, the links are up in the corner of the screen, please do share them with people that you think might find these educational videos helpful. As always, thank you to all my patrons. I'm gonna go work on the next video. In the meantime, stay nerdy, and I will see you in the future.